Good morning.
Good morning.
It may seem a little odd to kind of end the series, end the non-field trip portion of the series, at any rate, with a lecture, with a session on economics, because we came here as a variety of religious communities, and religious communities don't often focus too intently on economics. So let me take a moment to explain why we're doing it this way. When those of us on the committee organizing this session, this series, were trying to design the series, we wanted to create a space, as you know, we wanted to create a space in which our various religious communities could reflect on the question, how are we to live on God's earth? And the more we talked about it, as we struggled about how we might do that, it became increasingly clear to us that we really needed to build a conversation on economics into the overall discussion. Because I think it's fair to say that economics shapes the contemporary world in which we live more pervasively than almost any other way of thinking. It plays a huge role in national politics. And if you don't believe me, just turn on the television. It's one of the major ways in which we define our relationships with other nations. And I think it even forms, to a large degree, it forms our sense of how we as individuals are doing. Are we doing well, or are we not doing well? Economics is important at every level. We can't ignore it. But the problem we were grappling with was how to include it, how to wrap a consideration of economic issues and economic thought into this particular conversation. We didn't want to have an Economics 101 session. We didn't figure that would meld with the style of conversation that we're trying to do here. And as we were debating that question, I came across a book called Grand Pursuit, The Story of Economic Genius by Sylvia Nasar. And it seemed to me that this book provided exactly the context we needed. As I read the book, it began to dawn on me, I should have known this, but it began to dawn on me that economics isn't a set of fixed principles that have been handed down from on high and that can be distilled into a very small set of decrees or propositions. It's a way of understanding all the complex interactions between and within the human community and the natural world. It's a way of thinking not that came out of a laboratory, but a way of thinking that grew organically out of insightful reflections by particular men and women who are trying to understand the particular global context, the world, the social context that they were experiencing over the last 150 years or so. And so it became more and more obvious to me that in order to make sense, in order to get our arms around economic theory, we really need to know something about the people that birthed this way of thinking, and to understand the world as they saw it, the world that they knew. And that's what this book does. It does it masterfully, in my view. Sylvia got an awful lot of things right in this book. It happens that one of the people at the center of the story is Irving Fisher, who happens to be my grandfather. And I'm no economist, but I can tell you that she nailed Irving Fisher's life and the context out of which his thought emerged. So if that's any kind of a sample of the quality of the rest of the book, it's really, really good. And I'm absolutely delighted that Sylvia has been able to join us this morning in our somewhat quirky venture together. You have her full biographical information on the sheet that is on every table. And on the back, I'll just tell you that some of the texts we're going to be reflecting on are given on the back of that sheet. So I'm not going to say anything more about Sylvia, other than just to remind you that she teaches in the Columbia School of Journalism. She combines an academic background in economics with extensive experience in writing insightfully about the business world, the world of of economics as it is lived out, and in teaching others to do that. So she's here to teach us a little bit of in her writing and teaching. Thank you for joining us. Please welcome Sylvia Nasar.
Good morning. Reminds me why I was so glad that at Antioch there were no 8:30 classes. No, I'm actually an early riser, and I'm really delighted to be here. And I want to thank George and Gretchen and Angela for making this possible. I'm thrilled. I've been in front of so many audiences talking about A Beautiful Mind and now Grand Pursuit, but I've never had the opportunity to meet a group like you. So I'm really thrilled and interested, and I can't wait until we start talking about today's subject. So I'm going to just tell you some of the things that I came away with after 10 years of working on this book. And I should say that one reason that it took 10 years is that I didn't want to write a textbook. Most Americans hate economics. And I thought that the best way to try to understand and to communicate the amazing story of modern economics would be by telling a story. And it took a long time to figure out how to make it a narrative, how to make it a historical drama with blood and guts and lots of history, because economics and economic ideas came out of the dramatic history of the modern world. Now, in 1842, where the book starts with Charles Dickens, the world was just on the brink of an incredible revolution. And for the bottom 9/10 of humanity, okay, not the bottom 99%, but the bottom 9/10, the world has changed more in the last century and a half than it did in the 20 centuries before then. And the idea that human beings did not, or at least most human beings, didn't have to be slaves of dire necessity is so new that someone as enlightened, as much a creature of the European Enlightenment as Jane Austen, so new that Jane Austen never entertained it. It's a fact that in every society and in every epoch, whether ancient Rome or medieval China or Renaissance Italy, 9 parts in 10 of the whole race of mankind, and those, of course, are the words of Edmund Burke, lived no better than high-class livestock, no better than all the generations before. The material circumstances, and that means, material circumstances means the means with which that we have at our command to achieve our ends, the material circumstances of the typical citizen of the richest nation in the world, which was Britain, were no better than those of a Roman slave. Okay, 2,000 years of scientific, philosophical, artistic, legal advance had not affected the way that ordinary people lived. His shelter consisted of a single room shared with a lot of other people and some animals. The only heat he had was a smoky fire when he had that. His clothes were the ones that he wore on his back. And when he and his children weren't actually starving, they lived in chronic fear of death and disease by hunger. Sure, there were prosperous years and lean ones. There were richer and poorer regions. But the standard of life for the ordinary inhabitant of England and the rest of the globe never departed from very long from sheer subsistence. I should say that the average Englishman's caloric intake was a starvation diet of 1,500 calories a day. Okay. Today, the average caloric intake for the continent of Africa, which is the only region of the world where there's still large-scale famine, is around 2,600. Okay. In Jane Austen's lifetime, trade and the Industrial Revolution were swelling Britain's wealth, just as Adam Smith, the great Enlightenment philosopher and the founder of economics, had predicted. But even Smith accepted that the nation's growing prosperity, the growing wealth of the nation, would never trump God's condemnation of the mass of humanity to, quote, painful toil all the days of your life. Okay, so just think about it. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, when one technological miracle after the other was unfolding, in the richest country in the world, at a time when globalization was becoming more advanced than it is today, the pessimism about the prospects of the bulk of humanity was the received wisdom. In other words, the notion that the future would be very much like the past was very much in place, and that there was nothing anyone could do about it. And you see that that this view that the bulk of humanity was condemned to poverty would never have the material means to be what Oliver Twist, of course, asks the question, am I going to be the hero of my own life? Okay? Was an extraordinary question for someone not born in the upper 10%. Okay? An extraordinary question because, of course, most people had no expectation of having a life that involved choice to begin with. Okay? And so Thackeray, John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, a wide range of figures from the establishment to the extreme left, all believed the same thing, that the nation could get richer, but the bottom 9/10, the so-called proletariat, were a necessity of nature. And Okay. So then something extraordinary happened. Okay, just as the wisest people in English society were making these gloomy predictions, something extraordinary happened, and that was the Victorian economic miracle. So right here was about the publication of the Communist Manifesto, okay, which of course predicted that further things were not going to even just stay the same; they were going to get worse. And what you're looking at here is a measure of income per person. That's just the national, how much goods and services the nation produces in a given year, divided by the number of people. It's the most basic and really best indicator of living standards, of average living standards. And what happens is not a gradual improvement, but a rocket-like takeoff, okay? Something absolutely revolutionary, something completely unprecedented in human history, okay? So I really want to emphasize that for all of human existence, the average standard of living never was flat, okay? It briefly bumped up in the 14th century. Why? Because of the Black Plague, okay? Killed so many Europeans that the ones who survived had a little bit more to eat, okay? But no progress. All the technology, all the advances in knowledge, no impact on the way people live. And then, around the time that the Communist Manifesto was published, a rocket-like takeoff, okay? So that today, the average standard of living in the world, not talking just about the rich countries, is 10 times higher than it was in Jane Austen's day. People live, on average, and this includes everybody, okay? It includes China, India, okay? 2.5 times. In other words, the added lifetime is more than the average lifetime in Jane Austen's day. Okay, so trying to convey what a huge gulf separates modernity, the world that we live in, with the world of the past. Okay. All right. And the notion that man was a creature of circumstance, that circumstances were not predetermined, immutable, or impervious to human intervention, is one of the most radical discoveries of all time. Okay, and that is the idea. So the grand pursuit of economic thinkers was to overcome scarcity. It was to develop this idea that humanity could take charge of its and influence its material circumstances instead of being the object and the prisoner of those circumstances. And that new way of thinking, really started as an act of imagination, which is why the narrative starts with Charles Dickens as he returns from his book tour in the U.S. in 1842. And by the way, Dickens hated the United States because we were the China in terms of copyright violations. We were the China of the 19th century. Anyway, Dickens comes back to London, to England. England is in a deep recession. The cotton industry is, you know, having a big downturn. And of course, when the average person is living at subsistence, okay, recessions meant that death rates, malnutrition, hunger, disease shot up, okay? That's now, today, we have a nasty recession like the one that, that we just had. Death rates go down, okay? Because we're so rich that, that working less actually improves our health. Okay?
Oh, am I glad to hear that.
we can go back to that. Okay, so Dickens has just come back from America. He is full of a kind of new optimism about the ability of society to, to feed people, coming back from America where everybody ate meat every day, which he goes on at great length describing. And he wants to strike a blow for the poor. First he decides he's going to write a pamphlet. But being a great journalist and a very smart marketer, he decides that a story will do a much better job of, and what he wants to do is to attack the reigning pessimism, particularly as it's expressed by someone named Thomas Malthus, the reigning pessimism that it is possible to escape poverty, for a mass escape from poverty, okay? So he decides that a story is going to do a better job of conveying his message, and I'm happy to say that the story that he wrote is still in print. It's called The Christmas Carol. And the next time you read it, I hope the fact that it is an economic argument for a new kind of economics, an attack on the classical economist Malthus, will jump out at you. So this idea that humanity could change its material circumstances and influence its material was born in Dickens' London in the midst of the Victorian economic miracle, and over the next century and a half, it spread out like ripples in a pond until today it has transformed the lives of every single person on this planet. There is no place on earth anymore, not even North Korea or Burma or Somalia, where that idea has not taken hold among ordinary people. Okay. All right. So let me just go through show you a few more pictures, and just to make these takeaway points. Here you see the this is not the world. This is just the U.S. The rise in the standard of living, okay, which has been phenomenal. And we've all been obsessed with our current problems, and our current problems are very real. But it's also true that we here in the United States, but also in the rest of the world, have overcome many crises that were actually as big or worse than our recent recession. And all those crises never prevented us from, every generation, from living radically better than the previous one, okay? And you see that by this measure of the standard of living. Now, how is that possible? How is that possible? Well, there's only one way that could be possible, and that is that as a society, we learned to do more with given resources. Okay, this is very at the heart of what you have been talking about and thinking about all year. That is, unless you can produce more with the same labor, raw materials, et cetera, you can't lift any significant number of people out of poverty. Okay? So that's what happened. So behind this revolution in living standards was a revolution in productivity. That is, what you could produce for a given set of resources. Okay? And, you know, when this is that, you know, same old slide about the big takeoff, and you could label that the Victorian economic miracle, or you could label that as the Great Divergence, because what happened was that instead of all countries being universally poor and universally isolated, okay, what happened in the last 150 years and starting in the mid-19th century is that there was a great divergence in the performance of individual economies, okay? In other words, of course, that meant an increase in inequality of a certain kind. Some economies took off and their populations lived better, and others did not, okay? And what is stunning, if you know, about this period of 150 years is not just this radical change in average productivity and average living standards, but the fact that differences in economic performance have persisted, okay? So that the gulf that separates the most successful economies with the most dysfunctional is as big or bigger than the gulf between today's average living standard and living standards in Jane Austen's time. Okay, and you know, just to prove to you that it's not just, you know, that these national income data are in fact very good indicators. You know, we can also look at other measures like the gulf in average life expectancies, which has also grown. Okay, and it turns out, so why is that? Why is that? It's because, you know, all the difference, virtually all the difference in the average living standards in successful economies versus dysfunctional ones comes down to differences in productivity, okay? And again, productivity is just what you can do with what you have, okay? Because we still the same old human race, still the same old resources, okay? But now we can do multiples, okay? And the difference, for example, between the US and China obviously is shooting up like a rocket, but the fact is that in the US economy, we can do 10 and 15 times as much with a given set of resources as is possible in China, because China is still a poor country. China's average productivity and living standards are like the US's in 1930, okay, which was radically better than in 1970, but China's still poor, and the difference boils down to what are, you know, in our economy we can do more with the same resources, okay, and that's productivity. All right. So this really, what does this suggest? The fact that these differences, that over this whole period where you've had all these, you know, huge global forces, technology, globalization, education, what does that mean? That despite these huge global forces, there's still these enormous differences in performance, and that these differences have persisted. Well, you know, I think it means that the choices that individual countries make, okay, which are based on ideas, matters more than any of these large, vast global forces, okay? Because if that wasn't true, these differences would not persist, okay? So I'm just about to, and I'm just going to give you one example, okay, of something that is almost, you know, almost considered a truism. It's all technology. It was the Industrial Revolution. It's technology. Well, if you think that, you should take a look at medieval China. Because in the 15th century, while Europeans were living in the dark, you know, like, you know, livestock, the Chinese were inventing everything, okay? It seems that they invented everything. And I just came across the story of the courtier who invented paper, okay? But they invented the toothbrush, the, you know, gunpowder. The list goes on and on and on. Now, did all this invention, all this technology, did it have any impact on the average living standard of the average Chinese? As you can see, in 1950, the average Chinese was living no better than in 1 AD. Okay, so all this technology really didn't make, it never affected the average living standard. And if you think about it, technology, and you know, this was certainly true in the 19th century, technology can be imported. Technology, you know, so, but it seems to have a very different effect in different economies. So, so the conclusion that that I drew from all this is that ideas really matter. What you do with what you have matters a great deal more than what you have. And if you stop and think about all the, you know, historical examples with which you're familiar, if that was not true, Spain, not Britain, would have been the great power of the 19th century, okay? If that was not true, the Chinese takeoff after 1970, which was like this, would not have, would not have been that sudden, right? If it was, you know, how could an economy change overnight? They didn't have new resources. They still had the same old labor force. It wasn't education, as people often claim, because education takes a long time. You know, it takes 12 years to educate somebody at least. So that would have been a gradual improvement. Instead, it was like this. What happened? The ideas of the Chinese leadership changed, okay? They adopted a different set of ideas. Okay, so, you know, what are these ideas? Okay, the two figures in the book that, who I felt were the most pivotal are Alfred Marshall, who you've probably never heard of because he's practically been written out of, you know, popular histories of economics, who is really the, you know, the most important innovator, and Irving Fisher, who both Paul Samuelson and Milton Friedman told me independently and without my prompting them was the greatest American economist of the 20th century. And Alfred Marshall was going to be a minister, okay? He was a moral philosopher, okay? He was going to be a minister, he was going to be a missionary, but his generation was galvanized by the economic downturns of the 1860s, and they, you know, and motivated to become missionaries in their own land. They wanted to do something about poverty. He didn't like economics. He was a mathematician. He was but he was drawn to it because he was, he wanted to ask the question, is a proletariat really a necessity of nature? Is it possible for every man to be a gentleman? Which meant, would it be possible for every human being eventually to be able to choose the life that they were to live, as he had been able to do by overcoming a great many obstacles? And the reason that Marshall is so important is that he showed that that you could not, you know, at a time when Marx and a lot of socialists and actually a lot of Christian leaders were convinced that that the world was producing enough, that the only problem was really that it was that, you know, that production was maldistributed, okay? When most people thought that, based on their casual observation of a place like London where great wealth and horrible destitution were cheek by jowl, okay, he showed that no, that was not, it was not true that England was producing enough for everyone to have a decent standard of living. The only way that that the mass of Britons could escape poverty was if England could produce more per person, and that would require an increase in productivity. And the other thing that Marshall did, which is an insight that really bears a lot more contemplation now, was to show that the main institution in society that was responsible for increasing productivity and therefore real wages was the business firm, Okay, so a contemporary way of putting that is that the social and economic function of the corporation, okay, is not only to make its owners rich. Its social function is to raise average living standards in our society, okay? And that's what, and Marshall showed that in an economy where there is free competition, that the business managers are forced year in and year out to constantly look for incremental improvements in productivity, i.e., they're constantly looking to do more with given resources, okay? And that would be the way that the average wage and therefore the average standard of living was to rise, okay? So that was huge, and his insistence that it was a marathon, that economic circumstances were not changed. You know, what was important, the time frame that was important was not, this year, this year, this 6 months, this quarter, but the ability to produce those incremental changes that were so incremental that it was hard for people to perceive them in real time, that those incremental changes would add up to these huge gains in living standards. So in the 1860s, okay, when Dickens, in order to get Pip from, his place as a blacksmith's apprentice to his desired place of being a gentleman, required Dickens to bring in Miss Havisham, foggy moors, pirates, secret fortunes, and other fantastical elements, because the notion that, even an individual could rise that far was so fantastical, okay? Alfred Marshall was very confident and could show very persuasively that this was indeed possible, okay? That this was indeed possible, that the average income could rise so much over time that the average human being no longer had to slave away like a piece of high-class livestock. Okay, so that was huge. Because, of course, it informed, if that's what you believed, then you wouldn't do what his contemporary Karl Marx was suggesting was your only way out. Joseph Schumpeter, who was a brash young man who went to see, from Vienna, who went to see Marshall when Marshall was already a sage. Joseph Schumpeter is known for a book he wrote about economic development, okay, in which he basically shows that nations make their own destinies. We're not the victims of vast global forces over which we have no control. He went to Egypt when he was a young man, and when Egypt was the China, the hot emerging economy of the day where everybody wanted to invest, everybody wanted to go there. And what Schumpeter, the essence of Schumpeter's book is to say that it's entrepreneurs and their enablers, bankers, i.e. the two most reviled social groups in Victorian society, that they were the drivers of economic growth, of this process of mass enrichment. and that any country that provided a favorable environment for them could participate in this miracle, which is a very, it wasn't, you know, whether you were Anglo-Saxon or Chinese, or it wasn't whether you were a former colony, all the things, it wasn't if you were resource rich, all the things that, you know, conventional wisdom said, no, it was if you provide a favorable climate for business, okay? Not something that too many people wanted to hear, that in itself would enable you, with all your differences in culture and history, would enable you to participate in this miracle. And you know, later let's talk about Sweden and the United States, okay? Because that's a very good example of what he was talking about. This book has two heroines as well as heroes. You know that economics is a pretty much male, or was historically a male profession. Oh, sorry. Okay, so Beatrice Webb was a debutante, destined to marry a, you know, rich and powerful man. Instead, what she did was she married a short and ugly socialist, and she, together with him, invented the modern think tank and the idea of the welfare state. And her most promising pupil and protege was Winston Churchill, who was the one of the first people to actually implement her ideas, and this was before World War I. Okay, and what Beatrice was able to show and to importantly convince the movers and shakers of was that you could have, you know, you could take from the most productive members of society and give to the least productive without destroying the mechanism, that the dynamic that was making society richer, okay? Because before, there was a lot of pessimism about that. The thought was that, that if you did that, you know, that this productivity growth would stop. Well, you know, at the time that she was lobbying for her ideas, the bottom third of English society was so dysfunctional and incapacitated that they couldn't serve in the military, couldn't work, had, you know, radically shortened lives, were, you know, and whose productivity was so low that they couldn't sustain themselves. And what she was showing is that this is not, you know, that taxing, again, the most productive to put a floor, a minimum, under the living standards of the poorest citizens would actually make them more productive and would make the nation more productive. In other words, it was a supply side argument, and it proved, you know, the British were very practical. They were extremely reform oriented, but they always wanted to know, is it sustainable? Is it practical? Is it feasible? And she showed that you could educate, feed, you know, and provide public health to the poorest citizens without damaging the economic dynamic that was making everyone richer. And now we come to the hero that you know, namely George's grandfather and his partner in crime, John Maynard Keynes. named people who are rarely linked, but in fact, who were great allies in the 1920s in the wake of World War I. And they focused not on the questions that preoccupied Marshall and Schumpeter and Webb, these long-term questions, but they focused on exactly the kinds of problems that have mesmerized us, and that is the problem of recessions. That even, that despite this long-term rise, there were these sharp setbacks, including right after World War I. And Fisher and Keynes, so they were looking at the issue of instability. They believed that extreme inflation and extreme unemployment were incompatible with free markets and democracy. And of course, the history of Europe after World War I showed that they were right. And they believed that economic stabilization, that governments had to create the conditions that would allow economies to function and to grow. And this was their big insight, was that the root of instability had to do with the one variable that all governments, which were, of course, were radically smaller than modern governments, did control, which was the issuance of money. Okay, and that both unemployment and inflation were due to the same underlying cause, and that is monetary disturbances. And they took the further position, which outraged conservatives, that recessions were neither necessary, and when they happened, they didn't have to be endured. In other words, they were the champions of intervention and monetary expansion to fight the Great Depression. And finally, we have Friedrich Hayek, who was both a great admirer of Keynes and also the young Turk who wanted to beat his great teacher. And Hayek's contribution was not, contrary to what some of his fans insist now, was not his conviction that recessions were actually good things and had to be, and were necessary, and that it was a really bad idea to fight them. That was not his great contribution. His great contribution was really to address squarely the fantasy that was gripping, that for a very long time gripped intellectuals in the West, and that was that a system of central planning, i.e. socialism, was really superior to free markets and democracy. And he basically showed that that a centrally planned system not only could never deliver a high standard of productivity or a high living standard, which we now know is, has certainly been borne out, but also that you couldn't abridge economic liberty without abridging political liberty. All right, you know what? I think I'm going to stop now. I hope I've said enough things that you violently disagree with, or for us to have a good discussion. And I hope that you read Grand Pursuit, which I'm told is the easiest economics read ever, and I hope that the stories and inspire you. I don't think you'll learn so much economics from reading Grand Pursuit, but I hope that reading it would inspire you to learn more about ideas that really have been a tool for humanity to dig itself out of its age-old circumstances. Thank you.
I think the best way to move forward is to have a few minutes at least for question and answer just between you. And while that's going on, we will then move into a time of reflection at each table. And I've given you some textual resources on the back of those handouts. But I'm going to invite you to do something a little different. That's the usual way we proceed. Pick a text. Trouble is, those are my choices of what texts are most relevant. And what I would invite you to do on the back burner as you're engaging in this conversation is to think about what texts are you familiar with that you think really either oppose some of the ideas that seem to be bubbling up here or support some of the ideas that you've heard. In other words, what are the texts that speak to you individually about the ideas, the issues that we're stirring around this morning? Keep that playing in the back, and we'll come back. So, questions?
I was thinking about the context of sustainability in what we've been discussing, and I wonder in your when you think ahead through into the future, where do you see things changing in order for our world to be a more sustainable place?
Okay, this is obviously one of the central questions that you've been grappling with, and I would make two observations. One is that no no technology. Okay, let's say we look back at the technology of 1870 is sustainable. Okay, if it doesn't change. Okay, just think about if we were back at the productivity level of 1870, which is, let's say, roughly 1/10 of today. That is, took 10 times as many resources to produce, to support, the human population at a given level. Not sustainable, right? Do you agree with that? In other words, productivity growth is absolutely, the core of sustainability, right? In 1870, Britain was facing a huge energy crisis. Arthur Jevons, who was one of the smartest economists at that time, he was a metallurgist and wrote a book which predicted that Britain was, which underscored that Britain was running out of coal, and predicted that the British economy would stop growing, and the nation would decline, right? And if Britain had continued to depend on coal, that certainly would have happened. What happened? There was coal prices, of course, were going up, but what happened? There was a substitute. Okay, so that's essential. And the second thing is that I would assert that that economists whose grand pursuit it has been to overcome scarcity, that there's a lot to learn from them about this issue. Okay, both of resource conservation end of reducing pollution, okay? Because if we had the same emissions, I'm just reading Elizabeth Gaskell, you know, and I urge anybody here who is who loves to read these Victorian novelists, because they're all writing about the same things, okay? Because Elizabeth Gaskell in North and South describes pollution that is actually worse than Beijing's today, okay? And we would all be, you know, dying at 45 of asthma and related things if we, you know, if we still had the technology of her era, okay? We don't. So just think about that. Go ahead.
First of all, I loved your talk. I hated it too because I have these arguments with friends of mine who are business people, and if I read this book, I suspect I'm going to have to eat crow on a number of points that I keep making. The thing that really popped out to me was is a question of where quality of life comes in. I understand and I totally accept what you're saying about the increase in resources, and so, you know, in some ways what I'm talking about maybe is a bit bourgeois in its suffering, but, you know, if you look at our society, for example, you have record numbers of people on antidepressants. You have illnesses because of food quality that's not high. So we have huge numbers of people who are obese. So how does that factor into, you know, whether we're improved as compared to Victorian times?
Okay. First of all, you know, Alfred Marshall and, you know, these modern economists were primarily concerned with the quality of life. Okay, that was their. They understood that that the best measure of that happened to be, you know, the best available measure of that happened to be national income, but they never thought that the two were synonymous. It is, however, a fact that that they're closely, very, very closely related, and you know, as I pointed out, with this tenfold rise in the average standard of living, you know, the average material means that the average person has at his or her disposal, we've seen a concomitant rise in life expectancy and many, many other measures, literacy, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the other thing is that, and this is why it's so wonderful to go back to these early, you know, these Victorian economists, because later on they were put down as moralizing fuss budgets, okay? But in fact, they had a much more holistic view of, and this includes, goes all the way up to Keynes, a much more holistic view of you know, quality of life and economics. Because just think about it, that if you don't have, you know, you need material means to achieve spiritual, creative, artistic ends, to achieve any ends, to have any independence at all, okay? You have to have resources, okay? So increasing material means is not about materialism or economic determinism. It's about the ability of individuals to become the heroes of their own lives. In other words, to be able to choose their ends and have the means to get there, okay? Because without that, see, and this is why, you know, Marshall is somebody who looked around him and said, you know, there but for the grace of God. Because, you know, most young men his age were condemned to mind-numbing, endless labor, labor so tedious and so obnoxious and so exhausting that they, you know, really didn't have much of a life, right? I mean, right? You know, there wasn't time or energy for anything else except working like a, you know, like a unit of livestock. So that's what was always the vision, okay? And if you read Marshall and Keynes, especially on this subject, they are very, very eloquent about the relationship between material development and moral development. I mean, where are the highest standards of, say, ethics in the world? They're not in the poorest countries, okay? They're right here, okay? There are lots of things wrong with us, you know, with the rich countries, but these things go together. So, and you, okay, now, and let me just say one more thing, which is, and I think one reason that you may have a hard time stomaching is that what does this mean? And the example that I like to bring up is, all right, I'm going to ask you a question. Okay, what are the two most, you know, best performing stock markets in the world, you know, in terms of long run performance? What? Somebody said the United States. You're right. And what's the second one? Okay. Sweden. Okay. Now, let's think about this. Okay. Sweden, you know, I don't know what the opposite is the poster. Well, first of all, certainly the poster child of the you know, democratic left, right? Everything's great in Sweden. And the you know, number 1, 2, and 3 suspect of everyone on the right. Okay. Now, it is true that the welfare state in Sweden is twice as big as in the United States. In other words, about half, taxes are very high, and half of GDP, half of the national income produced by Sweden goes to the government, which does a lot of income redistribution, taking from the most productive to give to the least productive. Now, in the United States, our government as a share of expenditures, as a share of GDP is half of that, okay? So we're very different, and yet these two countries have very similar rates of productivity growth and growth in living standards. So maybe it's not the differences in government that count, but what Sweden and the US have in common, which is what? Does anybody know? What? Has anybody been to Sweden? What? Yes? What do they have in common? What is Sweden and the United? They have Lutheran. It's, you know, look, this is a good what I'm going to say, what they have in common is they both have incredibly dynamic, hyper-competitive private sectors, okay? In other words, their corporations, their managerial leadership is extremely high, okay? And what do those corporations do? They're the ones who are, so as different as Sweden and the United States are in many, many ways, and it doesn't seem that they have to be the same to both be super successful, that's what they have in common. Okay, Sweden, by virtue of the fact that it's always lived in the global, you know, very much in the global economy. It has to export to live. It has to compete. The United States, of course, is much more insulated, but we have tremendous amount of domestic competition. And in both cases, that competition has led to this fantastic record year in and year out of productivity growth. So the lesson there is it's not the tax rate or the expenditures that drive this. It's if you can, if you have a dynamic private sector, if your country's a good place to do business, you can have whatever welfare state your citizens want. Okay? It can be big if, your electorate is a bunch of, middle-class socialists. It can be little, like in the United States, but the tail that's wagging this dog is the, business climate and the dynamic private sector.
The concern I have with what you're saying is that what my understanding of the productivity increases, starting in the mid-19th century, is that it's really tied to exploitation of fossil fuels. And that without fossil fuels, it was the combination of technology and fossil fuel exploitation. Yeah. It was, as you said, technology alone did not result in improvement in living standards. And that the big problem with focusing so much on productivity is that if you define productivity as doing more with what you have, in fact, the world we have today is that those of us who live in wealthy countries are doing more with what other people have. We are using other nations' resources for our productivity gains, not our own resources. That's the sort of so the two moral dilemmas of fossil fuel extraction as driving productivity increases are that it's burning up our planet, and that we use other people's fossil fuels because we know how to utilize them and other people don't. That's what's happening now.
If I can just tag on to her, it's energy that your book doesn't talk about, your presentation didn't talk about.
I did. I talked about the energy crisis of 1870 when the whole Industrial Revolution, the whole Victorian economic miracle was about to come to a screeching halt. Look, okay, is there something different about that? It was also creating pollution that made most cities death traps, right? So,
then they switched to another form.
How did they switch? What enabled them to switch?
Technology. Oh, they switched to something. You didn't mention nuclear.
I looked in your index for the word energy and couldn't find it.
Okay, well, you can look for coal.
You have told us, and I love your book, you know that. But energy is assumed, it seems, in terms of the best use of resources. You've got to have energy as input to use them.
Well, you have to have a lot of things. You have to have land. Remember, the first thing is that we were going to run out of land, okay? Then we were going to run out of fuel. And what enabled, you have to ask yourself, what enabled the world to, the world population to grow sixfold at the same time that living standards rose tenfold? It was, in other words, if we used fossil fuels the way that we did in 1870, we would, all have black lung and etc. Okay, so the question is, what enables economies to constantly look for ways to economize on the most scarce resources? Because you know what you said. We live on other people's resources. Okay, well, they lived on ours too. But look at Russia, okay? Is it really what you have? Is it really the amount? Look at Saudi Arabia. Is it really, the amount of oil you have that determines your economic well-being and future sustainability?
No, I agree with your premise.
I don't think so.
Ideas. I think that's a really important piece of the equation. But it's got to be the ideas and the access to fossil fuels. And the willingness to use other resources.
Well, what are the ideas? Right. The ideas are basically, a decentralized free market, system, right?
Another idea might be growth is unlimited. Growth can go on forever. That's another really critical idea, which seems to be.
Well, except that, look, you think about the way that played out in the Soviet Union, okay, which is a very good example because the Soviet Union is, is incredibly resource rich, okay, relatively small population, incredibly resource rich. And what happened, in the 50 or 60 years where the whole tradition of Western economics was declared irrelevant and harmful. What happened? What?
The planning, 5-year plans and disasters.
Right. You had famines, in which 20 or 30 million people died. You had incredible environmental destruction that, is probably irreversible, like the Aral Sea. And you had a complete stagnation of living standards, not to mention, okay. So all I'm suggesting is, in every generation, there's been, a new, asteroid hurtling toward us, right? Okay, right now it's global warming, right? It's, doom is always around the corner, okay? So, and it's not that these things aren't real. The question is, what enables some societies to avert those dangers and others to succumb to them, okay? Why do some societies have famines? Why do some societies have okay? And that's where economics, the ideas of these thinkers is so critical, because it turns out that that these technical problems, okay, these technological problems seem to be solved. They don't seem to be solved by people, sitting down and planning how to solve them. They seem to be solved incrementally and in an evolutionary way through competition and an increasingly sophisticated welfare state. Yeah.
Let me break into this for a moment. This is a wonderful discussion, but what I think we need to add to that is the voice of our religious communities. And so I'm going to invite you. It seems to me that one of the challenges that religious institutions face in this century is to find a way of engaging constructively and creatively with the wisdom of a variety of secular ideas, but in particular with economic thought. And it's easy for us to get distracted by the economic argument. The question I think we need to grapple with is, to what degree are our religious traditions able to constructively engage this, to take advantage of the understanding, and to reflect deeply out of our moral perspectives. To do two things: to choose goals that are worth pursuing, and then to use the wisdom, the understandings, the tools of modern secular thought, which are obviously incredible, to accomplish those goals, to achieve those goals in ways that are really effective, rather than just spinning our wheels. I think religious institutions need to engage those two in a constructive conversation, and they're going to become increasingly relevant. So, let's get relevant in the last 20 minutes. I'm going to